The date is November 19, 1943. A Japanese rear admiral stands in the operations room of the Combined Fleet headquarters in Truk Lagoon, Caroline Islands. His name is not preserved in the American records, but his report is. He is staring at a map of the Pacific covered in red pins. Each pin represents a merchant ship sunk in the past 30 days. Each pin represents thousands of tons of oil, rubber, rice, ammunition that will never reach Japan or the forward bases that depend on that supply. There are 47 pins on the map for November alone, 47 ships. By the end of the month, the number will reach 63. The Admiral has been watching this pattern develop for 18 months. At first, the losses were tolerable, a few ships per month, acceptable attrition in a maritime war spanning half the Pacific Ocean. But the rate has been increasing. In 1942, American submarines sank 180 Japanese merchant ships. In 1943, the number will exceed 300. The trend is not stabilizing, it is accelerating. The Admiral looks at the pattern of the sinkings. They are not random. American submarines are positioned along the major shipping routes. They are hunting in packs in some areas. They are operating close to Japanese ports. They are sinking tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies. They are sinking freighters carrying rubber from Malaya. They are sinking troop transports moving reinforcements to New Guinea and the Solomons. The Admiral has read the intelligence assessments. American submarines are operating under a doctrine the Imperial Japanese Navy did not anticipate: unrestricted submarine warfare. They are targeting merchant ships as aggressively as warships. They are not following the rules of cruiser warfare that required submarines to surface and allow merchant crews to abandon ship before sinking the vessel. They are firing torpedoes without warning. They are sinking everything that floats. This is not how the Imperial Japanese Navy uses submarines. Japanese submarines are designed for fleet operations. Their mission is to scout for the main fleet, to attack enemy warships, to support the decisive battle that Japanese naval doctrine assumes will win the war. Japanese submarines are large, fast, long-range vessels built to operate with the battle fleet. American submarines, according to the intelligence reports, should be doing the same thing: hunting American carriers, supporting American battleships, preparing for the fleet engagement. Instead, they are sinking cargo ships. The Admiral writes in his report a phrase that will appear in multiple Japanese naval assessments over the next 2 years. The enemy is conducting a type of warfare we did not prepare for. This is not a story about submarines. It is a forensic examination of what happened when two navies designed their submarine forces for completely different wars and discovered that only one of those wars was the war actually being fought. It is the story of how the Imperial Japanese Navy built a submarine fleet to support a decisive fleet battle that never came, while the United States Navy built a submarine fleet to strangle Japan's economy and won the Pacific War from below the surface before the decisive battle could even occur. And it is the story of why Japanese admirals, watching their merchant fleet disappear ship by ship, were shocked to discover that the American submarine campaign was not a supporting operation. It was the main effort, and they had no counter for it. To understand what shocked them, you need to understand what they built. Because the Japanese submarine fleet in 1941 was by many measures the finest in the world, and it was designed for entirely the wrong war. Part 1. The fleet that prepared for the wrong mission. Let's be precise about what the Imperial Japanese Navy expected submarine warfare to look like in the Pacific. Because the expectations were not unreasonable. They were based on a coherent naval doctrine that had been developed over decades. The doctrine was called Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine. The theory was this: the American and Japanese fleets would eventually meet in a single large-scale naval engagement somewhere in the Western Pacific. This engagement would decide the war. Everything the Imperial Japanese Navy did was designed to win that battle. The battleships were designed for it. The carriers were designed to support it. And the submarines were designed to weaken the American fleet before the battle occurred. Japanese submarine doctrine called for the submarines to operate in advance of the main fleet. They would locate American task forces. They would attack American battleships and carriers. They would reduce American strength before the fleets made contact. When the decisive battle occurred, the Americans would be weakened by submarine attacks and the Japanese would have the advantage. This doctrine shaped every aspect of Japanese submarine design. Japanese fleet submarines were large. The I-class boats displaced over 2,000 tons surfaced. They were fast, they could make 23 knots on the surface, they had long range, they could operate for 90 days without refueling. They were designed to keep pace with the surface fleet and operate at the distances required for Pacific warfare. Japanese submarines carried the Long Lance oxygen torpedo. It was the best torpedo in the world in 1941. It had a range of over 10 kilometers, it was fast, it was reliable, it left almost no wake because it ran on compressed oxygen instead of compressed air. American lookouts could not see it coming. By the standards of naval technology in 1941, the Japanese submarine fleet was exceptional. It had the range to operate across the Pacific. It had the speed to keep up with surface task forces. It had torpedoes that could sink any ship in the American or British fleets. And it was optimized for entirely the wrong mission. Here is what the Japanese did not account for. The decisive fleet battle they had planned for did not happen in 1942. It did not happen in 1943. It did not happen in 1944. By the time something resembling the decisive battle occurred at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the strategic situation had already been decided. Japan had lost the war, not because they lost the fleet battle, because they lost their merchant marine. The American submarine campaign had strangled the Japanese economy. The oil refineries in Japan were running at a fraction of capacity because the tankers carrying crude oil from the Dutch East Indies were at the bottom of the Pacific. The aluminum smelters were shut down because the bauxite freighters from Malaya were gone. The rubber industry was crippled because the rubber shipments from Indochina were not arriving. The civilian population was beginning to starve because the rice imports from Korea and Taiwan were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. And the Japanese submarine fleet, designed to fight American battleships, was doing almost nothing to stop it. Part 2. The American doctrine that broke the rules. The United States Navy entered World War II with a submarine doctrine that was in many ways less sophisticated than the Japanese doctrine. American pre-war submarine strategy was not well defined. There was no clear consensus on whether submarines should support the fleet or operate independently. There was debate about whether submarines should target warships or merchants. That debate ended on December 7, 1941. At 4:41 p.m. Washington time on December 7th, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold Stark sent a message to the Pacific Fleet. The message was 3 words long: execute unrestricted submarine warfare. Those 3 words changed the nature of the Pacific War. They meant that American submarines were authorized to sink any Japanese vessel without warning, military or civilian, warship or merchant, tanker or fishing boat. If it flew the Japanese flag, it was a target. This was a violation of international law as it existed in 1941. The London Naval Treaty of 1930 required submarines to surface, identify themselves, and allow merchant crews to abandon ship before sinking the vessel. Unrestricted submarine warfare meant ignoring those rules entirely. The United States made that decision in the first hours of the war. The Imperial Japanese Navy never fully committed to the equivalent policy. Japanese submarines continued to prioritize warship targets throughout the war. They conducted some merchant raiding, particularly against Allied shipping in the Indian Ocean. But it was never the primary mission. The fleet support mission remained the priority. The Americans had no such limitation. Every Japanese merchant ship was a target, and American submarine commanders were expected to find them and sink them. But there was a problem. The weapon they were using to do it did not work. The Mark 14 torpedo was standard issue on American fleet submarines in December 1941. It was a sophisticated weapon. It had a magnetic influence exploder designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel and break the ship's back. It had a contact exploder as backup. It was designed to run at a preset depth beneath the surface to avoid being seen, and it was fundamentally broken in at least 3 different ways. First problem: the torpedo ran too deep. The depth control mechanism was miscalibrated. A torpedo set to run at 10 feet would actually run at 25 feet. This meant torpedoes were passing under their targets without exploding. Second problem: the magnetic exploder did not work reliably. It was triggered by the magnetic field of the target ship's hull. In theory. In practice, it was affected by the Earth's magnetic field, which varied by latitude. A magnetic exploder calibrated to work in the North Atlantic would detonate prematurely in the equatorial Pacific. Or it would not detonate at all. Third problem: even when the torpedo hit the target and the contact exploder was supposed to fire, the firing pin would often fail. the mechanism was too fragile. A torpedo hitting at the correct angle would crush the firing pin before it could detonate the warhead. American submarine commanders in the first year of the war fired torpedo after torpedo at Japanese ships and watched them fail. Torpedoes running under the target, torpedoes detonating prematurely, torpedoes hitting the target and bouncing off without exploding. The reports from submarine commanders were consistent. The Marker 14 did not work. The Bureau of Ordnance, the Navy department responsible for the torpedo, refused to believe it. Bureau had tested the Marker 14. The tests showed it worked. Therefore, the problem was not the torpedo. The problem was the submarine commanders who did not know how to use it. This institutional stubbornness continued for 18 months. 18 months during which American submarines were operating against the Japanese merchant fleet with a weapon that failed more often than it succeeded. 18 months during which submarine commanders were writing detailed reports documenting the failures and board was ignoring them. The solution came from the submarine force itself. Commander Charles Lockwood, commanding submarines in the Pacific Fleet, conducted his own tests. He proved the torpedo ran too deep. He ordered submarine commanders to adjust the depth settings manually. Board objected. Lockwood ignored them. Submarine commanders in the field began deactivating the magnetic exploder and relying only on the contact exploder. Board objected. The submarine commanders ignored them. When the contact exploder was found to be faulty, a submarine tender in Australia designed a fix. They machined new firing pins that were heavier and more robust. Board objected. The fix was implemented anyway. By mid-1943, the Mark 14 torpedo had been fixed. Not by the Bureau of Ordnance, by the submarine force working around Buard's objections. The depth control was adjusted, the magnetic exploder was deactivated, the firing pin was redesigned, and the number of Japanese ships sunk per month began to increase dramatically. This is the first piece of the puzzle that Japanese admirals did not account for. They assumed that American institutional systems would be slow and bureaucratic. They were correct. But they did not account for American submarine commanders ignoring their own bureaucracy and fixing the problem themselves. The Japanese Navy had its own institutional problems, but the culture did not permit junior officers to openly defy a headquarters directive the way American submarine commanders defied board. The institutional flexibility that allowed Lockwood to ignore the Bureau of Ordnance and implement his own solution was something the Japanese system could not replicate. Part 3. The math that destroyed an empire. Here is what unrestricted submarine warfare combined with working torpedoes did to the Japanese merchant marine. The numbers are precise. The numbers are catastrophic. In 1942, American submarines sank 180 Japanese merchant ships totaling 725,000 tons. This was significant but not crippling. Japan began the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. The losses represented roughly 12% of capacity. In 1943, American submarines sank 284 merchant ships, totaling 1,340,000 tons. The rate was increasing, but Japan was still building replacement ships. The net loss was manageable. In 1944, the system collapsed. American submarines sank 492 merchant ships, totaling 2,388,000 tons. This represented over half of the total merchant tonnage Japan had available at the start of the war. The construction of replacement ships could not keep pace. Japanese shipyards were building approximately 500,000 tons of new shipping per year. American submarines were sinking 5 times that amount. By the end of 1944, Japan had lost approximately 60% of its merchant fleet. The oil imports from the Dutch East Indies had fallen to a trickle. The rubber imports from Malaya had ceased almost entirely. The bauxite needed for aluminum production was not arriving. The rice needed to feed the civilian population was being diverted from imports to domestic production, and domestic production was insufficient. The industrial economy of Japan depended on imports. Japan is a resource-poor island nation. It had gone to war specifically to secure access to oil, rubber, and other strategic materials in Southeast Asia. The entire strategy of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was designed to create a self-sufficient economic bloc that could supply Japan with the resources it lacked. American submarines broke that system. The resources were still in Southeast Asia. The Japanese military still controlled the territory. But the ships carrying those resources to Japan were at the bottom of the ocean. Here is a specific example that illustrates what this meant in practical terms. The Palembang oil refinery complex in Sumatra was the largest petroleum production facility in Southeast Asia. Japan captured it in February 1942. It was capable of producing 14 million barrels of refined petroleum products per year. This was enough to meet most of Japan's military and civilian fuel needs, but the fuel had to be transported from Sumatra to Japan, a distance of approximately 3,000 nautical miles. The tankers making that voyage had to pass through waters patrolled by American submarines. In 1942, most of the tankers made it through. Losses were acceptable. By 1943, the loss rate was increasing. American submarines were concentrating along the tanker routes. They were using ultra-intelligence derived from broken Japanese naval codes to position themselves where the tankers would be. Ultra was the Allied code name for intelligence derived from decrypted Axis communications. American cryptographers had broken the Japanese naval code designated JN-25. This gave American submarine commanders access to Japanese convoy routes, schedules, and escort dispositions. The Japanese did not know their codes were broken. They continued to transmit operational details in code. American submarines received those details and positioned themselves to intercept. By 1944, the tanker traffic from Sumatra to Japan had effectively ceased. The tankers that attempted the voyage were sunk. The few that made it through were not enough to supply Japan's needs. The Palembang refineries were producing fuel that could not be delivered. The Japanese tried to adapt. They organized convoys. They assigned escort vessels to protect the merchants. But the convoy system was inadequate. Japan did not have enough escort vessels. The destroyers and corvettes assigned to convoy escort duty were pulled from other missions. Anti-submarine warfare had not been a priority for the Imperial Japanese Navy. The training was insufficient. The equipment was inferior. The doctrine was underdeveloped. American submarines learned to attack convoys. They would position themselves ahead of the convoy route, wait for the convoy to pass, fire torpedoes from close range, dive deep to evade the escorts. The escorts would drop depth charges. Sometimes they would damage or sink the submarine. More often, the submarine would evade and surface after the convoy passed. The exchange rate favored the submarines. For every American submarine lost to Japanese anti-submarine forces, dozens of Japanese merchant ships were sunk. The math was unsustainable. Japan was losing merchant tonnage faster than it could be replaced. The economy was contracting. The ability to supply forward bases was diminishing. The ability to feed the civilian population was failing, and the Japanese submarine fleet, designed to hunt American warships, was doing almost nothing to stop it. Part 4. The institutional failure of the I-boats. The Imperial Japanese Navy submarine fleet in World War II was not ineffective because of cowardice or incompetence. Japanese submarine crews were skilled, Japanese submarine commanders were brave, the submarines themselves were technologically advanced. The problem was doctrinal. The submarines were being used for the wrong mission, and the institution could not adapt fast enough to change the mission. Japanese submarines spent the war hunting for American aircraft carriers and battleships. They scored some significant victories. Japanese submarine I-19 sank the aircraft carrier USS Wasp in September 1942. Japanese submarine I-168 sank the carrier USS Yorktown at Midway after the carrier had been damaged by aircraft. These were important tactical successes, but while Japanese submarines were hunting American warships, American submarines were destroying the Japanese merchant fleet, and the strategic value of sinking merchants was far greater than the tactical value of sinking warships. Here is why. The United States Navy had over 100 aircraft carriers in commission by the end of the war, 15 fleet carriers, 9 light carriers, over 80 escort carriers. The loss of 1 or 2 carriers in 1942 was tactically significant but strategically irrelevant. The American industrial base was producing replacement carriers faster than the Japanese could sink them. Japan had 6 million tons of merchant shipping at the start of the war. There was no industrial base capable of replacing those ships at the rate they were being sunk. Every merchant ship lost was a permanent reduction in Japan's ability to move resources. Every tanker sunk was oil that would never reach Japan. Every freighter lost was cargo that would never arrive. The strategic calculation was clear. Sinking merchants was more valuable than sinking warships. American submarine commanders understood this. They prioritized merchant targets. When they encountered a convoy with both merchants and escorts, they would often ignore the escorts and attack the merchants. The merchants were the strategic target. Japanese submarine commanders did not make the same calculation. They continued to prioritize warships throughout the war. When presented with a choice between attacking a merchant convoy or searching for American carriers, they would search for the carriers. This was consistent with their doctrine, but the doctrine was wrong. There were Japanese naval officers who recognized this. After the war, in interrogations and memoirs, several Japanese submarine commanders stated that they had proposed shifting to merchant raiding as a primary mission. The proposals were rejected by the Naval General Staff. The fleet support mission remained the priority. This institutional rigidity was a fundamental weakness. The American submarine force had changed its tactics repeatedly during the war based on what worked. When the torpedoes failed, they fixed the torpedoes. When convoy tactics changed, they adapted their attack methods. When ultra-intelligence became available, they integrated it into operations. The Japanese submarine force did not have that flexibility. The doctrine was set at the institutional level. Junior officers could not change it. Senior officers were reluctant to change it because it would require admitting that the pre-war planning had been wrong. By the time the Japanese Naval General Staff seriously considered shifting submarines to merchant raiding as a primary mission, it was too late. The American submarine campaign had already achieved its strategic objective. The Japanese merchant fleet was destroyed. The economy was collapsing. The war was lost. Part 5. The final accounting. Let's examine the final numbers. Because the numbers tell the story of why the American submarine campaign was the most strategically decisive naval operation of the Pacific War. Total Japanese merchant shipping sunk by American submarines during World War II. 2,117 ships, 5,320,000 tons. Approximately 90% of Japan's merchant fleet. Total Japanese naval vessels sunk by American submarines, 214 warships, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, 11 cruisers, and over 100 destroyers and submarines. The merchant tonnage sunk was worth more strategically than all the warships combined. Because the warships could not operate without fuel, the bases could not function without supplies. The civilian population could not survive without food imports. By the end of the war, Japan was starving. Not because of bombing, not because of invasion, because the supply lines had been cut. The merchant ships bringing rice from Korea were at the bottom of the ocean. The fishing fleet that supplemented domestic food production had been sunk. The imports that had fed Japan's pre-war population were gone. American strategic bombing added to the crisis. But the primary cause of Japan's economic collapse was the submarine campaign. The submarines had done what the battleships and carriers could not do. They had isolated Japan, they had cut the supply lines, they had strangled the economy, and they had done it with a force that numbered fewer than 300 submarines operating at any given time. The entire American submarine force in the Pacific never exceeded 50 boats on patrol simultaneously. 50 boats. Destroying an empire. The Japanese submarine force, by contrast, had accomplished almost nothing of strategic value. They had sunk some American warships, they had conducted some supply runs to isolated garrisons, they had evacuated personnel from bypassed bases, but they had not materially affected the course of the war. The comparison is stark. 2 submarine forces, similar size, similar technology, completely different results. The difference was not the submarines, it was the doctrine. It was the mission. It was the institutional flexibility to adapt when the original plan failed. American submarines were given a clear mission: sink everything that floats under a Japanese flag. They executed that mission with increasing effectiveness as the war progressed. When the torpedoes failed, they fixed them. When the Japanese adapted their convoy tactics, the Americans adapted their attack methods. The learning cycle was continuous. Japanese submarines were given a mission that did not match the strategic requirements of the war: hunt American warships, support the decisive fleet battle. When it became clear that the decisive battle was not going to happen the way pre-war doctrine predicted, the institution could not change the mission fast enough to matter. Part 6. The shock and the verdict. The Japanese admirals watching their merchant fleet disappear understood what was happening. The reports were clear. American submarines were sinking merchants at an unsustainable rate. The economy was collapsing. The ability to prosecute the war was diminishing. What shocked them was not that it was happening. What shocked them was that they could not stop it. The Imperial Japanese Navy was one of the most powerful naval forces in the world. It had battleships, it had carriers, it had cruisers and destroyers. It controlled vast areas of the Pacific, and it could not protect its own supply lines from an enemy submarine force that numbered fewer than 50 boats on station at any given time. The shock appears in the Japanese naval assessments from 1944. The language is careful. The reports acknowledge the effectiveness of the American submarine campaign. They describe it as highly organized, systematic, ruthless. The reports note that American submarines are operating with intelligence that suggests code breaking. The reports recommend increased anti-submarine patrols, better convoy discipline, improved depth charge tactics. None of it worked. Because the problem was not tactical. The problem was strategic. Japan did not have enough escorts. Japan did not have the industrial capacity to replace the merchant losses. Japan did not have the ability to fight a submarine war of attrition against an enemy with superior numbers, superior intelligence, and superior torpedoes. And critically, Japan had committed its own submarine force to a mission that had no strategic value. The Japanese submarines hunting American carriers in 1944 were not contributing to Japan's survival. They were executing a doctrine that had been written for a different war. The American submarine campaign in the Pacific was not the most visible part of the war. It did not produce the dramatic imagery of carrier battles or amphibious landings. It did not generate headlines the way the island-hopping campaign did. But it was the most strategically decisive operation the United States Navy conducted in the Pacific. By the time the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, Japan had already been defeated by the submarine blockade. The military could not move fuel, the factories could not get raw materials, the civilian population was on starvation rations. The decision to surrender was accelerated by the atomic bombs, but the outcome was already determined. The Japanese admirals who watched this happen were shocked because they had built a submarine force to win a fleet battle and discovered too late that the war would be won by strangling the economy. They had optimized for the wrong problem, and their institutional system did not allow them to change course fast enough to matter. The Americans had entered the war with an unclear submarine doctrine and a broken torpedo. Within 2 years, they had developed the most effective commerce raiding campaign in naval history. They had done it by ignoring their own bureaucracy when necessary, adapting tactics continuously, and focusing on the strategic objective rather than the doctrinal preference. That flexibility shocked the Japanese commanders who were operating under a rigid pre-war doctrine that could not be changed without admitting fundamental errors in planning. The American submarine force changed tactics dozens of times during the war based on what worked. The Japanese submarine force executed the same doctrine from Pearl Harbor to the surrender. The verdict is this: the Imperial Japanese Navy built a world-class submarine fleet and used it to accomplish almost nothing of strategic value. The United States Navy built a submarine fleet that was initially equipped with broken torpedoes and used it to strangle the Japanese economy and win the Pacific War. The difference was not technology. Both sides had advanced submarines. The difference was not courage. Both sides had brave submariners. The difference was institutional. One system could adapt when the plan failed, the other system could not. The Japanese admirals, standing in operations rooms watching the red pins multiply on their maps, were not incompetent. They understood what was happening. They understood the strategic implications. But the system they operated within did not give them the tools to respond effectively. The convoy doctrine was inadequate. The anti-submarine forces were insufficient. And the submarine fleet that could have been retasked to attack American supply lines remained committed to hunting American carriers that were being replaced faster than they could be sunk. By November 1943, when that unnamed admiral was staring at 47 red pins representing 47 merchant ships sunk in a single month, the pattern was clear. The trend was undeniable, and the institutional response was too slow and too limited to change the outcome. The American submarine campaign did not win the Pacific War alone. The carriers won battles. The amphibious forces took territory. The strategic bombing campaign destroyed industrial capacity. But the submarines did something none of those other forces could do. They cut Japan off from the resources it needed to sustain the war. They made the conquest of Southeast Asia strategically worthless because the resources could not be transported home, and they shocked the Japanese admirals who had built their submarine fleet for a different kind of war, and discovered that the war being fought was the war the Americans had prepared for, not with better submarines. With a better understanding of what submarines could accomplish when used against an island nation dependent on maritime trade, the wreckage of the Japanese merchant fleet still litters the Pacific floor. Over 2,000 ships, 5 million tons. The physical evidence of what happens when one navy fights the war it planned for, and the other navy fights the war that actually matters. If your father or grandfather served on American submarines in World War II, I want to hear about it in the comments. What boat was he on? What did he tell you about the patrols? The official histories record the ships sunk and the tonnages. The stories in the comment section record what it felt like to spend weeks submerged hunting in enemy waters. Those details matter more than any history book. Write them down. They deserve to be preserved by the people who carry them.